Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to our webinar on compliance with TSA's new cybersecurity mandate for airports. I'm Alyssa Mathis, Convergent's Aviation Strategic Account Manager, and today I am joined by Michael Chung, one of Convergent's principal cybersecurity consultants, and Kyle Heaton, our aviation business development manager. In today's webinar, we are going to discuss the mandate and how Convergent can help you with this mandate. I will now hand it off to Kyle Heaton to dive a little deeper. Kyle, all you.
Great, thanks, Alyssa, and welcome to our attendees, who I'm assuming most of you are interested in today's webinar because we're all aware that airports are under constant cyber attacks by many bad actors, many foreign governments, and then quite possibly it's also because of the recent TSA cybersecurity mandates. Just for a real quick point for those of you not familiar with Convergent, we do not own or sell our own hardware or software. We're product agnostic, and we focus on systems and technology that solve business problems and challenges. As an example, you're going to hear from our cyber team, but they have been evaluating and implementing solutions that support requirements such as device hardening, password and patch management, and IoT automation. So with all that being said, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague and one of our principal cybersecurity consultants, Michael Chung. Michael's background includes expertise in cyber incident response, security program and policy management. And then his background also includes Department of Defense and Department of Energy Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. With that, Mike, you're a go.
All right, thanks, Kyle, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, we're going to be sharing a bit about the new TSA cybersecurity requirements. But before I do, I'll share a little bit about myself. As Kyle mentioned, I'm Michael Chung, cybersecurity consultant with Convergint, and I actually oversee the cyber efforts in the critical infrastructure verticals, of which aviation and transport is one of them, and also oversee our cyber program on the federal side of the house as well. And so some of the work we do, we specifically deal with ensuring compliance with various regulations and frameworks. And so that's a big part of what we do here. And as Kyle mentioned, in Formalized, I was with the Department of Energy, Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. I worked in their cybersecurity operations center, advising them on their security posture, and actually managed their endpoint security on their top secret and the secret and unclassified networks as well. And then prior to that, I was with the Department of Defense, working with the Joint Staff, working out of the Pentagon for those familiar with the DC area. And I was co-lead of their cyber incident response team. And so this is our agenda today. So we're going to delve into the new requirements that were put out by TSA for the aviation industry. It's actually a little ironic that I'm sharing with the aviation industry because I actually have a quasi fear of flying, but anything I can do to kind of make the friendly skies a little bit friendlier and a little bit safer, I'm all for it. So I'm happy to be here. And this is our agenda for today. First, we're going to look at the overall threat landscape, what it looks like, what we're seeing out in the wild, out in the aviation vertical, and also we'll talk about some of the drivers for some of these mandates and why they're doing some of the things that they're doing. And we'll also look at the timeline of events from TSA's perspective, right, to see how these mandates kind of came about, and then we'll look at the actual TSA mandates themselves, sort of like a 10,000 foot view of the requirements. And there's really 4 pillars that TSA lays out in the requirements, and we'll sort of touch on each of them at a high level. And as well as there's some documentation requirements that TSA lays out as well. And so we'll cover those here as well. And then we'll talk a bit about the compliance roadmap. Here we'll dig a little bit deeper, okay, into the four pillars, and talk at a tactical level, right, about how to start implementing the solutions to comply with these new requirements. And the goal here is that you leave here with a pretty firm understanding kind of what needs to be done, what the next steps are, and how to go about doing it. And also delving into the next, bullet point, how we can help, right? And so we'll touch on how we can help your organization comply, particularly on the physical security side of the house, since we're a physical security integrator. We have some solutions that will be able to centralize and automate some of these requirements, and some that will allow you to really outsource a good portion of it if that's what you're looking to do. And also really in the process, make your job kind of easier. And so, and then after that, we'll wrap up with a few questions. So in terms of the threat landscape, these are some of the things that we're seeing out in the marketplace. We are definitely seeing an uptick in attacks against the aviation industry. So here's a couple of headlines that kind of illustrate that point. The first one talks about a rising wave of cyber attacks levied against the aviation industry post-COVID, right? And then the next headline talks about Albany Airport, which got hit by a ransomware attack. And they actually got hit on Christmas Day. So it probably ruined a lot of Christmases for the staff. But we want to make sure that, that doesn't happen to you. So that's part of the reason that we're here. And then another headline is about Russian state hackers that attacked SFO, actually. And that hack was initiated by a Russian hacker group called Energetic Bear. Don't ask me how they came up with the name, but that's the name of the group that hacked SFO. And what they did was they tried to pilfer credentials and hack into a couple of their internal systems to kind of wreak havoc there. And then the last headline is for denial of service attack that targeted some of the major airports. There were 14 airports that were targeted, including LaGuardia, right? LaGuardia was hit, Des Moines, LAX was hit, O'Hare out in Chicago, Denver International Airport was hit, and they were attacked by a Russian hacking group called Killnet. And so we are seeing attacks specifically targeting airports. And I guess, by the way, I think it's important to mention that it's not just the US. We're seeing an uptick of attacks globally. So we've seen attacks hit Heathrow. They got hit Frankfurt Airport in Germany, Bristol Airport, and in the UK, and Warsaw actually got hit as well out in Poland. And so it's not just us. We're seeing it across the board globally. And so these are some of the cybersecurity challenges that we're seeing. This was an article actually from Forbes magazine. It shows that 97% of the world's top 100 airports failed a cybersecurity assessment. So, and you can see some of the findings here of some of the things that they found. And I'll just run through the numbers. 97% of them were kind of running outdated software. 24% of them had really no encryption or outdated encryption methods that were, able to be broken into. 73% failed their PCI DSS compliance, and so that's the credit card compliance framework. And 66% they found had data out on the dark web, and 87% they had data leaks out in public repositories. And so there's a lot of areas of improvement, and in many ways, I was thinking about it. The aviation sector reminds me a lot of what the healthcare industry kind of looked like several years ago. And they had a lot of the same issues, right? They were running outdated software. They had legacy systems, running old operating systems and firmware versions out on the OT side. And then, default passwords were rampant in organizations and their OT devices. There's no real patch management to speak of. And so, they, in terms of robustness, they lagged a lot of the sectors. So they lagged like the finance industry and things like that in terms of their cybersecurity defenses. And so when the attackers did begin targeting them, they just got killed, right? There was an onslaught of attacks, and there are huge hacks that occurred. You've probably heard Anthem, Blue Cross, and they continue to be targeted heavily, right? But the aviation industry, what I see is it's not quite there yet in terms of volume of targeting by attackers. So there's like this, a little bit like a calm before the storm, right? There's a little window of time here where we can bolster our defenses before the attacks occur. And so that's one of the drivers of the mandates that we've seen come out. They want to make sure that we're better prepared for when the attacks do come, because they are coming, right? And so it's just a little window of time where we can prepare a little bit and get a little bit stronger in our defenses. Okay, so so the colonial pipeline, I'll give you a little timeline of events. So the genesis of all this stuff really started on May 7th of 2021. That was when the colonial pipeline was hacked. For those of you on the East Coast, you probably remember it as the day that you couldn't get any gas, right? All the gas pumps were empty. And I remember going to the gas station, trying to fill up, and the pump literally just ran out of gas mid-pump, right? And I actually remember physically lifting up the hose to try and get every last drop of gas that I could. And so it was a huge deal that happened. It was a huge hack, a lot of ramifications that happened. And so for those that aren't aware, the Colonial Pipeline was hacked by, it was another Russian group. It was called Dark Side. And what happened during the course of events, Colonial Pipeline decided, as a precaution, they disconnected and shut down their OT operations, right? And so that's kind of an important mental note to make here, because it kind of explains some of why the TSA mandates are written the way they are, right? And why they care so much about OT. And so, the fallout of all this, aside from not having gas at the pumps, they ended up paying 75 Bitcoin, worth about $4.4 million. They paid it out to the ransom. And, but that attack really started the wheels turning at TSA. So now in terms of timeline, and I actually think, the timeline events is actually pretty critical to this conversation, and I'll tell you why. So I'll use a Star Wars analogy actually to explain. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I try to incorporate little nerd-like elements into my presentation. So, and it doesn't get any nerdier than Star Wars, right? So here's an analogy. So when Star Wars first came out, the first movie that came out was actually called Episode 4, right? A New Hope. And it's a great movie. The movie kind of stood on its own. It became a classic. If I ask anyone about Star Wars, they know exactly what it is, right? And so you could watch that movie by itself, and it was great. It was great by itself, right? However, to fully understand the breadth of what was going on, sort of the backstory of everything that was going on, there was these things called the prequels, right? Which occurred chronologically in the story, at least prior to Episode 4. And so after watching the prequels, you would be like, okay, I understand a lot better about what's going on, right? I get why Darth Vader is the way he is, why he wears a mask, why he acts the way he does. And I get it, right? I got the full picture, right? And the TSA mandates for aviation is kind of the same way. So, when the original aviation mandate came out, it was like Episode 4. It could stand on its own, right? You could look at it from a purely aviation perspective. You could read the mandate and try to execute on it without looking at anything else, right? However, so to really understand where TSA is coming from and what they want you to do as an organization to comply, you kind of have to understand that there were a few prequels that came out, sort of like Star Wars, right? There were a few similar mandates that came out for other verticals before the aviation industry one came out. And so that's why the timeline is important, because sort of like the prequels, it kind of provides some context, right? And background, and fills in the details of what you need to comply. So in terms of timeline, the Colonial Pipeline occurred, like we said, May 7th, 2021. 20 days later, TSA comes out with their first cybersecurity directive aimed at the pipeline industry. So for those that work in the government space like I have, things have a tendency to move kind of slowly in the government. So particularly for mandates or requirements that affect whole industries, right? But 20 days after this hack, TSA came out and said, you guys have to do this, right? You have to do this. And it wasn't overly burdensome. It was the first of a couple of mandates. So, following that model, it's likely that the aviation one, it's likely that this isn't the last you'll hear from TSA, right? Because they came out with multiples for the pipeline, and they're likely come out with multiples for aviation as well. And so 2 months later, in July of 2021, they came out with another security directive. And this one was a lot more in-depth, a lot more prescriptive. They had a lot of deadlines in there, associated with the requirements. And this actually got some pushback from the industry. They came back and said, look, this is way too prescriptive for us. We can't do this in the allotted time. And these deadlines don't make sense for us. And so to their credit, TSA actually listened to the feedback from the industry and released an updated security directive in June of 2022. And this was much less prescriptive. It gave some flexibility, to the organizations to implement them how they wanted. And so I actually think that's probably a big driver for why the aviation mandate is written the way it is. Because if you look at it, it's very high level. It's not very prescriptive. There's no real, deadlines associated. There's no real mention of how they would audit these things either. And so it's almost like a primer for things to come. And then in October of 22, TSA actually released it was a very, very similar mandate for the rail industry that they put out. And it has some security controls that we'll discuss in a bit. But some of the verbiage is verbatim, right, of what you'll see in the aviation directive. The only difference was it was a bit more prescriptive than what they put out for us, or what they put out for aviation, right, which we'll get to kind of in a bit. And then in March, TSA came out with the requirements for the aviation industry for us, right, which we'll sort of focus on for the remainder of the presentation. So here's a kind of a quick primer on the TSA mandate from a very high level. There's really four main pillars, as we mentioned, that make up the requirements. The first one is implementing or creating access control measures on critical cyber systems, and we'll do a deeper dive into what this means in a bit. But for now, just know that they want you to implement access control on your systems. And as a note, also, by the way, I would also add that TSA, although they don't mention it in the aviation mandate, they do mention it in the rail. Is how TSA defines critical cyber systems is essentially a system or device that would cause like operational disruption if it were to go down, right? And so personally, I would also add, any system or device that would degrade safety as well. So that's the first pillar. So the second pillar is implementing network segmentation. So going back to Colonial Pipeline, remember how they disconnected and shut down their OT systems, right, to stop propagation from the IT. So that's kind of a driver here, right? The goal that TSA states is this, right? They want to make sure that if your IT systems are compromised, which they can be through ransomware or what have you, your OT systems can continue to operate, right? And vice versa. If your OT systems are compromised, that it doesn't affect your IT systems. That is the intent of that control. And so the third pillar is implementing a patch management program to remediate any vulnerabilities on your systems. It's important to note here, particularly on the OT side of the house, is they specifically mentioned firmware here. So ensuring your firmware is up to date on your OT systems is part of the conversation, right? And then the fourth pillar is continuous monitoring and detection. That's being able to monitor for and detect and respond to threats on a continual kind of ongoing basis. Now they did have some kind of additional requirements that are more, documentation based, and so that were, that were added into the mix. One of them is develop an approved implementation plan that essentially what they're asking for is details of how your organization is implementing these 4 measures, right? And there's also an assessment piece to measure the effectiveness of the measures that that you implemented. All right, so now we're hitting access control again. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of these to see what each of these actually mean, right? So now the mandate came out in March, so it's relatively new, and it was new for me as well. And so the approach we kind of took to this was, all right, if I were a director of technology or airport director or physical security director in an airport, which some of you are, right? And TSA handed me this document and said, all right, there it is, do these items and go make it happen. How would I actually go about doing it, right? And so, and to be honest, when I first looked into it, I was a bit paralyzed almost, because TSA gives you literally 1 sentence to go off when it comes to access control, right? It just essentially says, just go implement access control. And I kind of realized I was paralyzed because the statement's so kind of broad, right? Like when you say access control, like what do you really mean by that? Let's just make sure we're talking apples to apples. And like where do we start? Where do you want us to start? And so, once I sort of, got past that paralysis stage, I kind of going back to the Star Wars analogy, I remember the prequels, right? I remember that TSA put out previous guidance to the rail industry that was very similar, but actually had additional, it was more prescriptive, right? So in essence, we rewatched one of the prequels. So, we reviewed the previous directive put out to the rail industry, and they had actually kind of laid a lot of it out. And so when TSA says access control, this is what they mean, right? It's codified on this slide. And so it was almost like when you're a kid and you're in school, and then you find the answers to the exam and you bring the answers back and you share them with all your friends. That's kind of like what this webinar is, right? We found the answers to the exam to what TSA actually means. And we're sharing it with all our closest friends here on the webinar. So when TSA says implement or create access controls, this is what they mean. So local and remote access control they're both in play here, right? Not just the person typing at the console, but any remote connections as well. Just making sure that these are fully authenticated prior to enabling access. Establishing a schedule for rotating passwords. And in addition to rotating passwords, I'll add one as well as getting rid of default passwords. So the reason I say that, default passwords are they're like the first thing that an attacker will try when trying to establish access, right? And so to sort of use a basketball analogy, I used to coach my kids in basketball, and I know I don't look like a basketball guy, right? But I am. I enjoy the game. And but when I was coaching, we had a motto that on defense there would be no easy buckets, right? Don't let the other team get easy bucks. No layups or anything like that. And the default passwords, they're essentially like a virtual layup for an attacker. It's an easy bucket for them. It's literally the first thing that they're going to try. So but we want to get rid of those as well. And one of the problems though is changing default passwords and rotating passwords. It sounds like a simple change, which it is, right? On one device, right? But spread out across, thousands of devices at an enterprise scale, it can grow to become like a Herculean task. So I know of one organization that spent, hundreds of thousands of man hours just changing default passwords because they had thousands of devices across enterprise. And so we'll delve into a little bit. We have some tools, at least on the physical security side, to try and centralize and automate that effort to make it much easier to do. But continuing on with what TSA is looking for, utilizing the principle of least privilege. So making sure people are given only the privileges necessary to perform their job function and no more than that, right? And so on the OT side, you could implement this through RBAC, role-based access control, and through the Windows security groups, those types of things. And then limiting the usage of shared group accounts. This would be like an admin account that 20 people know the password for, right? And so the problem with shared group accounts is that it makes attribution harder. And so there's got to be some procedures around them that need to be developed. For instance, if someone leaves from that admin group, then what happens? You can't have someone out there that's no longer part of your organization that has the credentials and got access to your system. So there's got to be procedures for changing the passwords and things like that that need to be thought of. And so TSA wants to limit their usage as much as possible. And then review existing domain trust relationships, making sure you still need them and that they are required for business functions and operations. By the way, I think it's important to note that, a lot of these things you actually might be doing already, especially if you're kind of tied into an Active Directory on the IT side. On the OT side, things get a little bit trickier, which we'll get to later on in the presentation. But on the IT side, Active Directory and things like that, you can do a lot of that through there. I guess it should also kind of be noted that when considering these 4 pillars, there's no real silver bullet, right? It's probably going to be a mixed bag of things that you're doing already, things that you can implement with your current tech stack. And then there are things that you may want to consider expanding your tech stack, in order to comply with these, if it makes sense. And then, continuing on further, supplementing with multi-factor. I know that's not always possible, but where you can, implementing that. And then documenting policies and procedures for access control, like documenting your password complexity requirements, password reset cadence, domain trusts, and things like that. And lastly, and this one's a little bit of extra credit, right? If you want to build a really, really robust access control program, this is a resource in this special publication 853. It's essentially a catalog of security controls. And it's really geared for the federal government, but can be used for private enterprise as well. And it lists out, access control, security controls, and it enumerates them one by one. And there's a number of them that you can consider implementing for your organization. Network segmentation. So when we talk about network segmentation, again, remember the intent, right? The intent is that the OT systems can continue to operate if the IT systems are compromised, and vice versa. So implementing some sort of segmentation to make that a reality. Now, I'll say a word of caution here when it comes to implementing network segmentation. So I know kind of shoehorning and retrofitting network segmentation into an already existing network infrastructure is not the easiest thing in the world to do. And segmentation is, to put it bluntly, it's one of those controls that can break stuff, right, if you do it wrong. And so if I were doing it in my organization, I would make sure that the IT folks, the OT folks, and the networking folks are in the same room, and they collaborate and work together to implement this control, and that they proceed with a certain amount of caution when implementing it. So there's different ways to do it, running the gamut from physically separating the 2 networks to implementing VLANs and ACLs and things like that. But you'll talk with your network folks, and you'll have to work with your network folks to sort of see what is right for your organization. And then for the implementation plan, there's a couple things TSA wants you to document. They want you to document any IT and OT dependencies, any external connections that are going out or coming in, and then any zone boundaries that you have defined. And then with those zone sort of boundary perimeters, any security measures that you have to secure those. For patch management, they want you obviously to apply the critical patches and updates. They also, again, specifically mentioned updating firmware as well. And so if you don't have any mechanism currently for updating firmware on your firmware-based devices, that's probably something you should start thinking about, right? Considering the emphasis that they put here. TSA wants you to categorize and prioritize the updates in a risk-based approach. One of the things you could do here, on the IT side, you may want to implement some vulnerability scanning, which in many cases will actually kind of do this for you, right? It'll tell you what vulnerabilities you have, what patches you're missing, and the criticality, and then you can prioritize your remediation efforts. You can direct your remediation efforts toward like the critical and high vulnerabilities. TSA also mentions prioritizing patches for vulnerabilities based on CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list. So we included a list, the link there, and then develop timelines for alternate mitigations where patches can't be applied. So if you come from the federal space, they have something called a POAM. It's a plan of action and milestones. That's what that stands for. And so basically the intent is if something can't be remediated right away, you document it there along with a plan to remediate the risk. And you can do this either through future patching, or if you can implement something called compensating controls, where you're like, hey, I'm going to segment this off and let nothing talk to it or something like that. You could do that. But essentially, TSA wants you to have some way to document and plan to remediate that risk, right? All right, so continuous monitoring detection. Again, going back to the previous directives, these are a few things TSA is looking for: defending against malicious email, monitoring and blocking malicious code and communications. So, blocking on the endpoint and then blocking traffic to malicious domains or known command and control sites. Auditing communications, particularly traffic that goes outside of normal baselines. So, some of the few things that we used to do out in the federal space was we would document, we would have tools to be able to find the top talkers, like large outflows of data or inflows of data. Also, like communications to what can be deemed like adversarial nation states like China, Russia, or Iran. And then collect and analyze for intrusions and anomalous behavior. We sort of talked through that already. And then lastly, again, a focus on OT, right? Measures to isolate OT in case of an incident. And so that's continuous monitoring. So now the next couple slides talk about, okay, now that we have this mandate and we kind of have an idea of what TSA is looking for, how can we help, right? And so we have a couple of product partners that have the ability to meet some of these requirements. And like I mentioned before, there's no real silver bullets, but there's definitely things that we can help with. And so now, for the purposes of this webinar, right? Because every airport or organization, whatever organization you're associated with, represented on this call, it's a bit different. And so we work with a number of product partners that do different things and fill different voids. And so for the purpose of this call, at least, I'm going to remain vendor agnostic. I'll share from a high level what capabilities our product partners bring to bear. And then, if I share a capability and you're like, yeah, we don't do that and we need that, right? Then at that point, my counsel would be, hey, reach out to the person that invited you. And then at that point, we can have a deeper conversation about what you're kind of looking for. And we can talk about specific solutions at that point that are kind of tailored. Once we hear your needs, we can sort of tailor the solution to your organization. So delving into this, the first thing we can help with is, helping with implementing access control, particularly on physical security systems and devices to help meet those TSA access control requirements. So we can assist with changing default passwords at an enterprise scale on physical security systems and devices, ensuring passwords, meet complexity requirements, and then enabling scheduling password rotation, right, on a regular cadence, and as specifically called out in the directive. So the goal of this being that the password management on the organization's OT side is closer in line with the policies they have enabled on the IT networks. And so So it's, same, essentially. And so another thing we can assist with is offering patch and firmware update capabilities, and essentially providing the ability to centrally push out firmware updates to physical security devices. So instead of doing one by one, which a lot of organizations do, and that's time consuming, use a lot of manpower and things like that, we can do them in bulk. This specifically addresses that firmware requirement in the mandate, right? And so also it allows for automating and scheduling of those updates. If you want to schedule them around maintenance windows and things like that, so you don't cause any operational issues or outages during peak times, this allows you to do that. And it also, if you're in an organization or airport that has a diverse set of devices, right, lots of manufacturers, different models, those updates can be pushed out, and we can streamline those firmware update operations. And lastly, it gets rid of those critical vulnerabilities in a timely manner. I actually spoke with our partner about this, and they said they check the manufacturer on a daily basis to see if there are any new firmware updates that are made available to the organization. So those updates are almost real time, right, for you. And so some additional benefits of implementing our solutions that are a little bit outside of the mandate, but still very, very helpful. Right, is providing health monitoring of the physical security devices. So you can have like dashboard views of which devices are up and down, also which devices are out of compliance from a security perspective, which ones have old firmware, which ones require password resets and things like that. It also allows you to be able to see end-of-life devices that are coming up in a dashboard view, so you can easily track those. And then because you can track them, you can budget accordingly and eventually cycle them out during your next tech refresh. And so also, health monitoring of network switches, and also one of the things, if money is an object for you, which probably is with a lot of organizations, you can reduce costs by significant amount by doing things like remote reboots and remote triage of the devices. Instead of physically sending out a technician out to service the device, they can do things remotely. And the side benefit, it makes their job a lot easier. So these solutions really hit on two of the pillars, the access control and the patch and firmware updates. And then we also have partners in the MDR space, which is managed detection and response, which answers the mail for many of the tenants that TSA is looking for in terms of the continuous monitoring and detection. So, I was thinking about the real benefit here is that some airports and organizations, they may not have the staff or expertise to manage their own 24/7, cybersecurity operations center. And so we run into a lot of customers that have, limited resources, limited personnel. And, quite frankly, standing up a cybersecurity SOC is, even one that's not 24/7, it's not that easy, right? So where you have multiple trained analysts that are eyes on glass watching and monitoring everything that happens on the network, it's difficult to set that up from scratch, right? So these customers are like, look, I don't have the time to do that, right? And I don't have the people for that. And so I just want to outsource a lot of that cybersecurity monitoring and detection and leave it to the professionals so that we can focus on our real jobs here at the airport. And so that's sort of what our MDR solutions allow them to do. It does continuous monitoring and detection capability, as well as 24/7 SOC monitoring to help meet that TSA requirement. And then one of the differentiators for some of the partners that we work with is the MDR folks that they're staffed similarly to how our cyber team here at Convergint is staffed. So in other words, their technical staff comes from the three-letter agencies out of the federal government. So NSA, DOD, CIA. And so they bring that kind of nation state level technical experience to the MDR space. And so even if you did have the time and resources to set up your own SOC, that type of talent is hard to find, right? So so they make that available to you. And so Their solution has the ability to detect lateral movement, anomalies in network traffic, which we talked about was one of the things that they were looking for, tradecraft of malicious actors, and also does endpoint detection to identify malicious behavior, which we talked about as one of the tenants as well. And so all this information is sent to 24/7 SOC, which is manned by their trained security operations staff for analysis and response. And so it essentially allows you to outsource that entire monitoring piece, or at least a big piece of it. So, and then lastly, the actual verbiage of the TSA mandate calls for the implementation of some documentation. So that includes things like the implementation plan, the assessment piece that we spoke about earlier, and some policies and procedures. And so this is something that we're capable of doing and helping with, but in full disclosure, it's not really one of our mainstay offerings. But from a business perspective, we typically stay on the technical implementation side rather than on the consulting or document development side. But that being said, if there's a client that does ask for us to consult or develop some of these documents, it's something that we could potentially help with under the right circumstances, right? And so typically when we do these type of engagements, there's an MSA or SOW that's executed, and that kind of spells out the terms and the bill rates and all that kind of stuff, right? And then so even though it's not one of our kind of mainstay offerings, I did want to include it in the presentation because it is something that we're capable of doing and able to help your organization with. And so a couple of resources for you that will help you out. So first is the actual link to the cybersecurity requirements as put out by TSA for aviation. And then next is the security directive TSA put out for the rail industry that we pulled a lot of this from. It has a lot more verbiage about what TSA is looking for, like we kind of alluded to in the presentation. And then next is a link to 853, which I talked a little bit about before. That enumerates a lot of the security controls. So I brought it up in the access control section, but it covers a number of families of different security controls. So it's a great resource if you're in the process of standing up a cybersecurity program. You can see what sort of controls are out there. And then lastly is a contact email for TSA. This was pulled from the rail directive since there really wasn't any contact info provided in the aviation one that I saw, at least. And so this can help get your implementations plans approved, and they should be able to walk you through that sort of approval process. And so here's a sort of 4-step compliance roadmap that we put together. The first step is to consult with us, right? And so the account executive or whoever invited you to this call, whoever that may be, they'll be reaching out to you to see how we can help, right? How we can help you and your organization comply with these things. And I'll say this, if that person does not contact you, I would reach out to them and be like, hey, what do you have against me, right? So this is something that we have to have. These are I would let that these are requirements. These are TSA requirements, not suggestions, right? So we have to do this. So get with the person that invited you here today. Use them as a resource to help you sort of drive the compliance, and then assess your compliance status. Now that you kind of have an idea of what TSA is looking for, do an assessment, right, of your organization. Like what pieces do you already have in place? What gaps do you see when you compare what TSA is looking for to what you have? And then, a part of the roadmap is, okay, now that we know that, what technical solutions should we consider as part of that? And then develop an implementation plan based on that assessment. And then, the final step is implement the solutions and, hopefully become compliant, right? And so, so with that kind of concludes my portion of the presentation. I know I threw a lot out at you. I tried to cram as much info as I could in this little window of time, but hopefully that was helpful. And so now I'll turn it over to Alyssa, who will talk a little bit about contracting and contracting vehicles. So Alyssa, if you wanted to share.
Thanks, Michael. The presentation was fantastic. Lots of great information in there. And so, for our clients out there, or, people that have joined the call and you're wondering, okay, I want to reach out, I want to work with Convergint, but, generally it's hard for me to contract with someone new. Well, so Convergint does have what we call cooperative purchasing agreements. So we work with the major cooperative purchasing contracts out there. We have, we're on Sourcewell, Omnia, and NCPA. We have the ability to use those to help you contract these services and get where you need to be, whether that be, our partners' products or Michael's expertise on the matter, anything like that. You can use these to get there. So instead of having to go through the traditional purchasing path of an RFP, you could use these to get what you need from Convergint. It doesn't remove that RFP process, but really it supplements it. They've done the RFP process for you, and you're able to use that to then work with Convergint directly. So if you, are reaching out, you feel free to ask about these. We can definitely let you know if you're a part of any of these. Our team is very well versed and we can help you through that. But yeah, like Michael was saying, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us or whoever invited you to this call. They'll get you connected with us and we can start that process with you if you have any questions. So don't see any questions popping up in the Q&A. So if no one has any questions and you think of them later, don't worry, feel free to reach out. We are happy to answer them, not on the live webinar if that's preferred, or if you just have to think about it first. But with that being said, we will wrap up and let you have some time back in your day. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thanks, all appreciate it.